It's time for a little story. The beginning of the notorious 5th chapter of Dream of the Red Chamber is a little bit unorthodox. Sure, the whole book is unorthodox, but this chapter is particularly unorthodox. So, we know by now that Jia Baoyu and Lin Dayu are supposed to fall in love. They're not just made for each other, they are actually the human embodiment of a premortal stone and a magical fairy plant. And you thought that this was serious literature. Well, there are a few mythical elements back in the first chapter that would probably make a pretty trippy science fiction story in case anybody's interested in writing it. Anyway, Lin Dayu winds up living with the Jia family. That's a long story. However, at the end of the 4th chapter, we then get to meet a guy named Shui Pan. So Shui Pan is not just an oaf, he's also a murderer, and he needs to get out of Dodge before the authorities realize that he actually did order his servants to kill an innocent man. But of course, this is Dream of the Red Chamber, which means that the focus is not on Shui Pan and his murderous exploits. Nope, it's on his sister, Shui Baoyu, a talented woman with a clearly scholarly bent. So, have you ever read Pride and Prejudice? Have you ever noticed that nobody in the book actually does any work? Well, Dream of the Red Chamber is kind of similar. Nobody seems to care about earning money. Most of the men are off committing heinous crimes or wasting their time with this or that, and most of the women wind up spending their time reading books, sewing, and writing poetry. And this is one of the most important literary works of all time, go figure. Anyway, Shui Baoyu is now living with the Jia family as well. This means that Jia Baoyu now has 2 girls to go after, and people in the family are already working behind the scenes to set him up with one or the other. We get to this really odd phrase in the book, something that doesn't make a lot of sense in English. In English, I translate the section like this: Baoyu was still in his childhood years and was naturally simple and eccentric. He gave the same amount of affection to his sisters and brothers, making no distinction between those close to him and those more distant from him. Alright, this is where Dream of the Red Chamber starts to get really philosophical. I say that because it doesn't make sense. The Chinese original says that Baoyu was foolish and eccentric. I've simplified that a little bit to simple and eccentric. Foolish here is probably in the old Zhuangzi sense, that things that are actually wise will seem foolish to most people. But the odd part is that Jia Baoyu is described as foolish and eccentric because he treats others around him as equals. So what's up with that? Okay, I don't profess to be an expert in Confucianism, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong. My understanding, though, is that Confucian thought puts a ton of emphasis on social structures and hierarchies. Jia Baoyu, meanwhile, simply does not have the time or patience to deal with things like that. Well, I've mentioned in previous videos and in commentary posts on my blog that a major focus of Dream of the Red Chamber is qing, or human emotion. Jia Baoyu and Lin Dayu are both described as being overflowing with this qing, to the point where it literally defines their characters. The orthodox Confucian thought of the day, though, seems to have been the opposite of qing. It seems to have been focused on convention and order at the expense of feelings and emotions. Well, I guess that it could just be a straw man that Cao Shuiqin has created, but if it is a straw man, it's a really convincing one, at least to me. I say that because a lot of this applies to our own day, in my opinion. We live in a world that is uncomfortably utilitarian, a world where art for art's sake seems to be an impossibility. It's a world in which politics rules everything. So Thomas Gradgrind from Dickens' Hard Times would feel right at home in the modern world, and Cao Shuiqin seems more concerned with that Gradgrind mentality than with anything else. Anyway, Jia Baoyu's insistence on being nice to everyone else apparently created a split between him and Lin Dayu. And you know what that means, right? Lin Dayu feels upset because he was carrying on friendly conversations with Shui Baoyu. The book doesn't say so directly, but it's pretty obvious. Well, one day they had a disagreement, leaving Lin Dayu to cry in her room. Now, we're going to need to get used to Lin Dayu crying. In the beginning, before she goes to Earth, she swears that she will repay the stone, Jia Baoyu, with her tears. This is because the dew that helped her gain her human form dripped off the back of the stone and onto her as a flower. There's some pretty interesting cosmic significance here, stuff that most people miss. So Jia Baoyu didn't actually choose to do anything to help the random fairy plant out. The dew simply rolled off of his back as he was a stone, right? He was in the right place at the right time. Lin Dayu, meanwhile, is not actually fated to go to the Earth and cry all the time. No, she chooses to do this. She figures that this is the best way that she can repay Jia Baoyu, or the stone, for what he or it gave her. You might remember that talk earlier on about a karmic bond in my last video. Well, this bond is a deliberate karmic bond that Lin Dayu enters into on purpose, even though she knows that she'll only be sad in the end. It's pretty heavy stuff. Anyway, back to their fight. Jia Baoyu goes in and apologizes, and all is well. Later on that day, he and the ladies in the household go across the street to the Ningguo mansion to look at flowers and drink wine. Baoyu feels tired, but Lady Qin at the Ningguo mansion tells him he doesn't have to go all the way back home to rest. They have a room for him right there. She takes him into this room that has this huge painting on the wall. It's called Ran Li Tu in Chinese, which is translated as the picture of burning the goosefoot or something like that. This is what goosefoot or li looks like. It's a green flower that makes a really big flame when you burn it. Anyway, the story here is that the old Han Dynasty scholar Liu Shang would burn li to help him see when he was looking through ancient texts at a pagoda. He was allegedly visited by a mysterious old man who taught him deep points of wisdom. Anyway, the phrase Ran Li eventually took on the meaning of engaging in deep study, sort of like burning the midnight oil in English. So you probably know this by now, but this is just the way that the Chinese language works. Any phrase that you can find has some sort of long story behind it, and of course you've got to learn the story when you learn the phrase. It can be annoying at times, but you do get used to it eventually. Jia Baoyu took one look at that picture of Liu Shang and felt upset. But why? Well, the problem that Jia Baoyu has with Liu Shang is that he's a representation of Confucian learning. So you remember that bizarre passage that I mentioned a few minutes ago? Jia Baoyu was trying to escape the Confucian mores and structures around him. He feels upset if he's suddenly faced with them. But the thing that really got Jia Baoyu frustrated was the poem next to the painting. It's not that hard to understand, actually. The first line means clearly understanding the ways of the world is true learning, and the second line means fully mastering human affairs is true literature. Jia Baoyu freaks out and screams that he needs to leave the room at this second. Which brings up that question again, why? Alright, let's dig into this a little bit. Alright, so in Chinese, the first line reads, 事事洞明皆学文. 事事 means the things of the world. Dongming means to clearly understand, to completely penetrate, and Shuiwen means something like knowledge, wisdom, or learning. So the translation is pretty clear here. Clearly understanding the ways of the world is learning. Well, I say true learning in my translation. That's to emphasize the point of the sentence. To really learn something, in other words, means to know the ways of the world, according to this poem. But that really is a Confucian ideal. There's nothing here about spiritual transcendence or mystical communication or anything even remotely artistic. It is utilitarian by nature. You learn by seeing how people interact in society, by mastering those interactions, and by then taking advantage of what you've learned. And Jia Baoyu hates that. It clashes with his nature at a very fundamental level. The second line is 人情练达即文章, and of course it's parallel to the first. 人情 means human feelings or human emotions or even humanity, and that's that word 情 again that keeps showing up. When zhang means writing or literature, today it means an article like in a newspaper. Now, lianda is the hard part. That also means something like to clearly understand, but there's also an interesting implication here, one that implies manipulating something to serve your own purposes. And you know, that's the reason why Jia Baoyu is so frustrated. There's this meaning in the original poem that's a little bit hidden, one that implies that to really create art, you need to learn how to manipulate the emotions of other people. I think quite a few people these days would actually agree with that sentiment, especially here on YouTube. Anyway, Jia Baoyu simply cannot stand it, and he demands to leave the room at once. Anyway, so we had this simple two-line poem followed by a response that seems bizarre. But when we dig deeply, we realize that it's another sign of what Jia Baoyu's character is really like. He's overflowing with qing, as we said before, and we can almost call that something like the artistic spirit. Well, you see, poems in this book are different than in other books, including other Chinese classics. So when you read it, you can skip the poems in Romance of the Three Kingdoms or even Journey to the West and still understand the story. But you can't do that in Dream of the Red Chamber. The poems are the story. They're the whole point. Well, that's going to get worse. You see, Chapter 5 is the chapter of poems with a ton of predictive poems that are kind of hard to figure out. I'm going to go through them slowly, and I'm going to try to catch every bit of meaning that I can. So come on over to my blog and join me in my journey. Well, there's a lot more where this came from. Now remember that there's not really one right or wrong interpretation to this stuff. I could be way off base, and as always, let me know in the comments if you disagree. However, you should know that anything that you see in this book that is bizarre or nonsensical is something that you should probably look more deeply at. Don't just skim it over so that you can claim that you finished reading the book. Read it properly. See you next time.